Hey, good morning, everybody. I hope you're having a great day. Tonight is Rosh Chodesh Av, which begins the mourning period of the 9 days. We blessed the new month on Shabbat, and we will be having Rosh Chodesh. And tonight at sundown, we stop eating meat, drinking wine. Stop going swimming and all celebratory things till after Tisha B'Av. So I wanted to tell you a thought that I think is a good perspective as we get into these 9 days of mourning and of sadness. And it's a Dvar Torah that Rabbi Israel Meir, who was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv and then eventually the chief rabbi of Israel, writes in his gripping autobiography, Out of My Depth. It's a book that I recommend all of you read. Give you some perspective on where we come from and the struggles we've been through and our strength for survival and overcoming. Rabbi Lau was born in 1937 in a little town called Petrikov, which is in Poland. He was 2 years old when the Holocaust started, and he was 8 years old when he was liberated from Buchenwald. Rabbi Lau was separated from his dad in 1942, I think. In 1941 was the last time his father, who was the rabbi in Petrikov, and they came from a lineage of 30. Rabbi Israel Meir Lau was the 38th generation of direct rabbis, one after the other without stopping. And his father was the rabbi of Petrikov until 1941 was the last time he gave a speech when he was beaten by the Nazis and thrown off of the podium, and that was the last speech ever given. He was taken to Treblinka, I think, with another older brother of Rabbi Lau, where they were both gassed. Rabbi Lau himself, in 1944, together with his mother, Rabbi Lau was called Lulek. He had an older brother who was 16 who was called Tulek. Rabbi Lau and his mother and his brother Tulek, and their mother were taken to the camps, and they were herded onto a train. And Rabbi Lau says he remembers clearly his brother and all the men were pushed into one cart, one freight, where presumably they would be sent to work, and his mother was pushed with him, a little boy. He was then 3 years old, 3 years old, was pushed into another freight. And right before the train was about to take off, his mother took him and threw him out of her hands into the hands of Tulek in the other train, and looked at her son Tulek, who was 16, and says, "Tulek, look after your little brother Lulek. Goodbye, Tulek. Goodbye, Lulek." Rabbi Lau says in his autobiography, which again I recommend you read, that he never in his life cried so much at that moment, and he never in his life cried again as much afterwards, the last time he saw his mother. And he said it took him so many years to really understand and appreciate after the Holocaust that his mother, when she pushed him away and saw him for the last time, was really trying to save him so he shouldn't be killed as she was gassed in the gas chambers. His brother Tulek smuggled him into a sack and smuggled him into the camps, and he was saved. He survived. He was liberated by the Americans in 1945. The last words Rabbi Lau heard from his father was his father telling his older brother Tulek, "Look after your little brother Lulek. I don't want the lineage, the chain of rabbis to be broken. He's the 38th generation." Rabbi Lau says that when he was liberated, one of the American officers gave him an extra suitcase. They had American soldiers had an extra suitcase. He took it, he cherished it, and he put all his belongings in. And when he immigrated to Israel, it traveled with him from educational center to educational center. He would never leave go of that suitcase. But when he got married, his wife encouraged him to please get rid of it, but he refused. He said, "This is who I want. I want my kids to see one day when they complain about what they had, I want them to see what their dad had." And one time when they moved, he put it into the attic of his apartment, and he came back a few years later when they were moving again, and it was disintegrated. The only thing left was the handle. But Eli Wiesel, who was with Rabbi Lau in Buchenwald, gave him a picture that he had of the American soldier took of this little 8-year-old boy with a suitcase. And Rabbi Lau said he put the picture on the left side of his door as he walked out of the house. And he had the mezuzah on the right side. And he said, when I went out, I wanted myself always to look at that picture of little Lulek and say, look, I was saved. Look what I have to live up to. And then I would look at the mezuzah on the right side and I would say, look who I have to answer to. Rabbi Lau became the chief rabbi of Israel. In 1993, he was appointed the chief rabbi of Israel. Think about this history, 38 years of generations of rabbis. When he became chief rabbi, he decided he wants to go back to Petrikov to preside in this shul over there and to give a speech to continue the memory of his father and the plea of his father that the chain should never be broken. Imagine, the last time a speech was given there, a Dvar Torah, was over 5 decades ago, in 1941, when his father was beaten and thrown off the pulpit and sent to the chambers. And he came to give a Dvar Torah. You know which week he came? He came to Shabbos, the parsha of Shabbat Chazon, which is this coming Shabbos. It's called the vision. It's when we read the Haftorah of the vision of destruction, of what's going to happen, and the vision of what's going to happen afterwards. And I want to tell you a part of the Torah that he says, which is so inspiring that it stays with me till today. Rabbi Lau says a story about a midrash. The Midrash Rabbah, which is a midrash, says on Lamentations, on Eicha, a fascinating story that happened like this. When God was destroying the first temple through the Babylonians, Abraham, our forefather, our patriarch, came and cried to God and says, God, how could you do this? How could you hurt my kids so much? You are our father. Look what you're doing to them. They're being murdered. They're being butchered. God, what are you doing to my children? And God says to Abraham, Abraham, they broke the Torah. They didn't listen to the Torah. So Abraham turns to God and says, God, who's giving witness that they broke the Torah? And God says, the Torah will come. Came the Torah to give witness, and Abraham looks at the Torah and says, are you not ashamed? Are you not embarrassed of yourself? You, who God gave to all the nations, and they rejected you, and they didn't want to take you, and the only people who embraced you were the Jewish people and kept you, you are going to give testimony against the Jewish people? Continues the Midrash, immediately the Torah became quiet. So God says, no problem. The 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet will give testimony. As we know in Judaism, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet is not just the letters of the alphabet, but that's how the world was created and formed. There's a lot of holiness to it. Comes along the Aleph and marches along. The Aleph is the first letter. It says, I'll give testimony. Says Abraham to the Aleph, you're not embarrassed with yourself? You are the first letter of the 10 Commandments that the Jews embraced wholeheartedly when everyone else rejected. You're going to give testimony? Be silent. And the Aleph became silent. Came along the Beis, says the Midrash. And he says, the Beis, you're the first letter of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elokim. You're going to come give testimony against the Jewish people who kept the Torah and cherished it and learned it and studied it. Be quiet. And the Beis became silent. Came along the Gimel. And he says, the Gimel, you, the first letter of the commandment from God, Gedilim Nas Allah, to make tzitzit. You, the people who keep the tzitzit, who wear them, the only people, you're going to give testimony. Be quiet. And the Gimel became quiet. And suddenly, all the letters of the alphabet just became silent. Said, Abraham, God, you gave me a child at 100 years old. And then you asked me to bring him as a sacrifice when he was 37 and I didn't question you. How could you not remember that? Came along Isaac and says, and me, I readily agreed to be that sacrifice. How could you not remember it? Came along Jacob and says, me, who busied myself for all my years to build the 12 tribes. How could you forget it? Came along Moses and says, what about me, Moshe Rabbeinu, who was the shepherd loyal to your people for 40 years. I nurtured them in the desert and you didn't even let me go into the land of Israel. Are you going to forget that? Came along Rachel, our matriarch Rachel, and says, God, you remember when my father tried to trick Jacob into marrying Leah, and Jacob knew and he gave me signs that I should use under the chuppah, And then when my father did that and I didn't want to embarrass my sister, I wasn't jealous. I gave her the sign so she shouldn't be embarrassed. And you are jealous of the Jewish people that they worship silly idols? And suddenly God listened. When God heard the words of Rachel, God says, I hear a voice on high. And I promise you, your children will be brought back to their borders. This is all, I'm giving you the talk that Rabbi Lau gave in Petrikov in 1993, the 38th generation, after 5 decades of no voice being said. But then he continued on, Rabbi Lau, and he said a Dvar Torah, a thought from his father-in-law, Rabbi Frankel, who was the rabbi in Tel Aviv, the chief rabbi in Tel Aviv. And Rabbi Frankel says that in Deuteronomy, in Vayelech, in the end of the Deuteronomy, it says these words. It says, when bad things will happen to the Jewish people, and then it will answer, this song, this Torah will answer as a witness that the Torah wasn't forgotten. The simple meaning actually means something else. Rabbi Frankel says like this. Moses was having an argument with his great-grandfather Abraham. He says, Abraham, you told the Torah to be silent, not to give testimony against the Jewish people. You told the Hebrew alphabet to be silent, not to give testimony against the Jewish people. Well, guess what? I am saying that when the bad things happen to the Jews, I don't want the Torah and the alphabet to be quiet. I wanted to answer. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to give a testimony to how the Jews were during the Holocaust. That they went hungry without bread for days so they could save up something. They shouldn't have to eat bread on Passover. I will remember that the Jewish people smuggled in tefillin to wrap their tefillin. I will remember the way they were proud of their Judaism and took care of each other. He says, Moses says to Abraham, I don't want the letters of the alphabet to be quiet. I want them to give testimony to the nature, to the character of who the Jewish people are. Those are the words that Rabbi Lau said 5 decades after his father was pulled off the pulpit and taken and butchered and gassed in Treblinka. 5 decades after he was separated from his mother, as his mother threw him out of his hands to his brother so he could be saved. So the chain, the link, the rabbinic lineage shouldn't stop. Here we are beginning the 9 days. It's a time of period, a time of mourning for the Jewish people. And we have to listen to the words of Moses. We have to give testimony. We have to ask the Torah and the Hebrew alphabet to give testimony about the Jewish people's love for Torah, about their commitment. And we have to tell God that there's enough time in exile. We want to be reunited with our Father. The Jewish people want to be together in Eretz Yisrael in the Holy Land of Israel. May Hashem give us that these days, the 9 days, a period of mourning should be turned over to days of joy, to days of happiness, to days of love, with the coming of Mashiach, with the Messianic era being ushered in, as Isaiah and Jeremiah promised us. Have a great day.